Sometimes we are confronted with a situation so intense or a problem so heavy that it compels us to ask the big questions. For me, that time came as a result of a young man's story. And the questions I pondered were, what exactly are my Jewish values? And how can I live by them? By all accounts, Edward Clary was a good kid. He had none of the advantages or opportunities most of us in this room enjoy, but he remained a good kid. Edward grew up in a part of St. Louis in which high school dropout rates often exceeded 50%, and yet he made it all the way through school. His city, like so many others in the U.S., lost most of its good-paying blue-collar jobs as the manufacturing industry shut down and moved overseas. Unemployment rates often topped 17% in Edward's area, and most of his contemporaries made money the only way they could, by small-scale drug dealing. And yet, Edward managed to avoid that path. He made it through high school without ever getting involved with the drug trade, and unlike most of the young men in his area, he had never been arrested and had no criminal record. Edward was a good kid, but he had a problem. He had just turned 18, and he could no longer count on the support his father regularly provided. He needed to help his mother pay the bills and make rent, but he couldn't find a job. There were entry-level jobs outside the city, but it would require him commuting to and from to get to work, and Edward couldn't afford a car. He was becoming desperate. If he couldn't help his mom pay the rent, they were at risk of being evicted. On a visit to California right after his birthday, his friends encouraged him to take the only job opportunity available in his neighborhood, dealing drugs on the small scale. Edward felt he had no other choice. He had to help with the bills. So 2 months after his 18th birthday, his friends gave him a small amount of crack cocaine, less than 2 ounces, to get him started. Upon his return to St. Louis, he was stopped in the airport and frisked by police. The police said that Edward, this young man who had no police record and no prior experience in the drug trade, looked like a drug dealer. They of course, found the drugs Edward was carrying and charged him with possession of crack cocaine, a felony. The penalties for possession of crack cocaine are literally 100 times more severe than those for equal amounts of powdered cocaine. This continues to be true even though research has long shown that there is no difference between crack and powdered coke in terms of addictiveness or harmful effects. The only substantive difference between these two forms of cocaine is that crack is found predominantly in the inner cities and is used mostly by people who are black and brown. Alternatively, powder cocaine is found predominantly in the suburbs and used mostly by people who are white. But whether in the inner cities or outer suburbs, the research consistently shows that people engage in drug use equally across ethnic groups. If Edward Clary had been a white kid from the burbs and had had powdered cocaine in his pocket that fateful day, his life would have taken a very different path. Study after study have shown that in the unlikely event that a white person is stopped and frisked by police and found possessing drugs, they are much more likely to be charged with a misdemeanor instead of a felony. If Edward had been white, he would have likely served no more than a couple of months in jail, if any time at all. But Edward was a young black man, returning to his home in the inner city. The cocaine in his pocket was in rock form rather than powder. So just a few months after his 18th birthday, Edward Clary was found guilty of felony drug possession and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. I first learned about Edward's story last summer while reading law professor Michelle Alexander's powerful book, The New Jim Crow. In it, she lays out a clear and convincing argument that shows Americans' current mass incarceration system is a product of acutely racist laws and policies that had their origin in post-Civil War Jim Crow era. It was distressing to learn just how completely the American justice system is stacked against certain segments of the American society. Systematic prejudice seems to prevail at all levels of our judicial system. The research shows that police tend to target inner cities for drug offenses and disproportionately stop and frisk people of color. And after a person has been arrested, prosecutors have tremendous discretion to decide how they will handle that case. They often can either charge the person with a felony or with a misdemeanor, or drop the charges entirely. That decision, however, often hinges on the accused person's skin color. An analysis conducted in the year 2000 found that African Americans were more than 6 times as likely as whites to be sentenced to prison for identical crimes. And the prejudice doesn't end when a person's time in prison is over. Those with felony convictions suffer ongoing discrimination. Those labeled former felons are precluded from accessing subsidized housing or food stamp programs. In many states, they are also prohibited from voting, and most employers won't even interview someone who has checked the box. That's the box on most job applications that asks if you've ever been convicted of a felony. As a result of these ongoing biases, many people labeled as former felons, often for petty crimes that would not even be prosecuted had they been white, are left unable to find work or housing or provide for their families. So for Edward Clary, any chance of what most of us would consider a normal life with normal opportunities and normal dreams ended when the police decided he looked like a drug dealer. He, like hundreds of thousands of others each year, was denied access to equal justice in the American justice system. As I learned more about Edward and the state of the American mass incarceration system, my mind was awash with questions. What does Judaism say a legal system should look like? How do we define justice? What is my stake in this issue as a Jew? It's not difficult to see why this issue is important to me as an American. This country is supposed to be based on the rule of law. Our justice system is supposed to be blind and fair. We are told that we are one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The inequities that exist run contrary to everything we learn in civics class. But as a soon-to-be rabbi, I am interested not just as an American, but as a future leader of Jews as well. I am committed to living by and leading from Jewish values. All of this brought into focus my most urgent question. Do we, as Jews, have a direct stake in the issue of unfair mass incarceration? Most of us will spend very little time in the inner cities. Most of our congregants will never be subject to the aggressive stop and frisk tactics experienced by Edward Clary. Is there any reason why we should see this type of unequal treatment as a distinctly Jewish concern? I delved into our tradition for answers and came to the conclusion that as present and future Jewish leaders, as people responsible not only for teaching Jewish values, but for living them and emulating them as well, we have no choice but to see the plight of Edward Clary and the hundreds and thousands of others like him as our own. I believe this because ingrained in the Jewish value system is the ideal that a legal system must be fair and just. This idea is rooted in Torah and spans across time. In Deuteronomy 16, God instructs the Israelites to set up a legal system and to govern the people with due justice. So important is this idea of justice that God exhorts the Israelites, tzedek tzedek tirdorf, Justice, justice you shall pursue. The verse goes on to suggest that the Israelites' very ability to thrive in the land as a people depends on justice. But what does it mean to pursue justice? If it means simply enforcing the laws of society, then there is no room for redemption for people like Edward Clary. Edward was indeed caught breaking the law. U.S. laws are written such that rock cocaine is penalized significantly more than other drugs. If justice is only about following and enforcing the law, then there is no hope for people like Edward. But Torah tells us that there is more to justice than following and enforcing law. The laws must also be fair, with equal access to all. In the heart of the Holiness Code, Leviticus chapter 19, we find, "You shall not render an unfair decision, do not favor the poor or show deference to the rich. Judge your kinsmen fairly." As this verse makes clear, our Torah stresses the importance of a fair legal system. But lest we think that a legal system based on equal access and fairness is only a minor Jewish concern, consider this passage from Midrash Rabbah Devarim on Parashat 15. Rabbi Simeon ben Gamliel said, "Do not make a mock of justice, for it is one of the 3 feet of the world." Why? For the sages taught, on 3 things the world rests: on justice, on truth, and on peace. So know full well that if you wrench away fair judgment, you shake the world, for it is one of its pillars. Our sages taught that our very world depends on equal access to a fair and just legal system. And yet the American legal system, as it stands today, is not fair and just. The American legal system wrenches away fair judgment from hundreds and thousands of Black and brown people each year. If our status as American citizens is insufficient to move us to action, surely our values as Jews committed to the ideals of T'Shelem Elohim, that all are created in God's image, and Tikkun Olam, that we are tasked with healing the world, must compel us to take a stand and to act. But what can we do? The problem is so entrenched and pervasive, it's overwhelming. How can we make a difference? I don't have a definitive answer, but I do have 2 suggestions. First, make yourselves aware of what's going on in our legal system. Since few of us have ever lived in the inner city, and most of us, by virtue of our skin color, will never be subjected to the aggressive tactics police often employ, it's easy to be unaware of the scope of the problem. I highly recommend reading Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. She supports the thesis of her book in extensive detail. I found it incredibly eye-opening. You might as well. Second, use your power as a citizen to change the system. We have an election coming up in a few days. The ballot contains a proposition known as the Safe Neighborhoods, Safe Schools Act, Proposition 47. I believe Proposition 47 is one small step towards addressing this odious problem, at least in California. The proposition changes the 6 lowest level felony offenses to misdemeanors. These are petty, non-violent offenses such as petty theft and low-level drug dealing. People serving time for these offenses could apply for release and pursue life without the impediments inherent in being labeled a former felon. Additionally, Proposition 47 stipulates that the money saved from incarcerating fewer people would go towards restorative justice and drug rehabilitation programs in neighborhoods and schools most at risk for violence. Prop 47 is a step towards pursuing justice for those who've been denied it for so long. It's a small step, for sure, and many more are needed before we can meet the ideal described in Torah and Midrash. But it's a start. So, when you're in that voting booth next Tuesday, I encourage you to consider Proposition 47. Consider what Torah says about fairness and equal access, and what the rabbis taught about the import of justice. Consider the ideals of B'Tselem Elohim and Tikkun Olam, as well as your responsibility as a Jew and a Jewish leader. When you're in that booth next Tuesday, I encourage you to consider all of this and to vote your Jewish values. Thank you.